Everyone, and yes, indeed, I'm actually normally based in London, but now in a lockdown in Germany. Actually, also in a COVID lockdown until the 24th. So that's the one good thing about this virtual space. We can meet wherever we are and in what condition we are. So I'm glad to host this distinguished panel today. Thank you, Enes, for the nice introduction. Let me introduce myself quickly. I'm Hatice Küçük. I'm the head of the London office at Sovereign Strategy. We're a political strategy firm dealing with G20 affairs on health and financial services. And obviously, Brexit is close matter to all of us, and even to me tonight. But I'm here as a friend of Enes tonight, and I will say a few words about the Circle Foundation, which I'm sure not many of you are not familiar with you yet, because they're quite new, but quite powerful. The Circle Foundation is a London-based think tank that is non-partisan and that is dedicated to create innovative studies that focuses on national and global matters that concern all of us, be it COVID, be it Brexit. And the main focus of the foundation is obviously focusing on the UK-Turkey angle and how this impacts the future Brexit impacts the future relations. So I'm glad to be hosting the panel tonight. As you know, we stand here almost at the 11th hour. Sunday might be the day where all the alarm bells ring. Either we get a deal or we don't. And I mean, I will not speak today much. I want to listen to all of our speakers on the panel today, what they have to say. You know, will we have a no deal? What does it even mean having a no deal? And if we have a deal, what kind of deal would that be? And especially looking at Rebecca, what does it mean for Europe? And looking at all the other speakers, what does it mean for the United Kingdom? And for those who are Europeans in the United Kingdom. So there are many questions to be answered. And just to start off with that, the Prime Minister was speaking a year ago around this time of an oven-baked deal. And I think that deal is still in the oven and kind of rotten by now. But let's see where the deal will be. 1,800 pages already, as I hear. And sources say in Europe, as Dan Hodges, who I will take on the floor first, he has written, Prime Minister has spoken to Ursula Von Der Leyen. Sunday is the hard deadline. So what does it mean? Anyway, without further ado, let me introduce all of you. And then we will have around 45 minutes to get your input on the current landscape. And then I will open the floor for a few discussions. So I look forward to the 1 hour, 50 minutes that we have with you. So today we have a lot of great input, and it will be a very interesting discussion with Dan Hodges, who is a columnist and commentator for the Daily Mail on Sunday. I'm sure many of you know Dan. Hi, Dan. Welcome. We have Professor Jonathan Portes, Professor of Economics at King's College, but also known for the initiative Changing Europe. Very interesting analysis, Jonathan, that you have done. We would like to hear more about your New Deal analysis that you have done a few months ago. Rebecca Christie, visiting fellow at Bruegel and former Bloomberg correspondent. Welcome, Rebecca. We look forward to hearing your European views. Tom Harvard, good to see you, Tom. Tom is a senior reporter at Guido Fawkes and a columnist at The Telegraph, and also, I think, known to many of you who watch television. Professor Thomas Sampson is also with us today. Hello, Professor. He's a professor at LSE and also a research fellow for the Center of Economic Policy and Research. And yeah, we would like to hear your take, what will happen in the next few months on the economic landscape. So without further ado, I want to give the floor to Dan Hodge. So speakers, please take 5 to 7 minutes to give your take on the current situation, and I will be going through each speaker one by one. Thank you. Dan, the floor is yours. Do we have Dan? Oh, I can't see Dan. I think the hosts are sorting it out. All right, then let's move on to Jonathan Portes. Jonathan, can you give us an analysis about, what has changing Europe been doing over the past few months and weeks, and what's your current take of the current deal or no deal situation?
Okay, so I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is that I'm not going to predict whether there's going to be a deal or not a deal. I don't know. I'm not sure anyone really does. We know from experience that the Prime Minister makes up his mind at the last moment, as he did when he decided to support Leave versus Remain. I don't think there's any reason to think this time is different, so I won't speculate about that. What are the implications? I think the most important thing that I always try to get through is, I think there's two things that are really important. One is the deal versus no deal, and one is short versus long term. On the deal versus no deal, the most important thing to remember is that most of the changes that will happen on January the 1st will happen deal or no deal. We will leave the single market and the customs union. There will be new customs checks, border controls, and various regulatory barriers. There will be a regulatory border down the Irish Sea. All of these things will happen deal or no deal. No deal will add on top of that tariffs, quotas, and various other inconveniences. But the analysis, and I will leave that to Tom, because really Tom did most of the work on the analysis that we produced. The analysis that we produced and that others have done the same, the government's own analysis shows the same thing, is that the main economic impact of Brexit will happen deal or no deal. And you saw that in the OBR's recent projections, the government's own official forecasts, which suggested that while a deal, even the deal that was on the government hoped to secure, would result in a reduction of our national income relative to what it would otherwise be of about 4% over the next decade or so. No deal would add an extra 2% on top of that. But you get 2/3 of the damage just from even in the event of the deal. And again, that is pretty much the consensus among pretty much all the serious economists who've looked at this, all the serious modeling. So that's the first thing to make clear, is that deal or no deal, there will be major new trade barriers between us and the European Union. That will have economic consequences. That's point one. The second point I'd make is that is the difference between the short term and the medium to long term. So if there is major disruption, queues at ports, all the rest of it, backlogs, and I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. Economists can't really predict that. It really depends whether the computer systems and the other systems that government and businesses have put in place work or not. We won't know that till they're actually tried. It's amazing that we're coming to the situation where we genuinely don't know whether they'll work because we haven't tested them properly yet. That is a sad indictment of the government's incompetence, but we are where we are. But I think the important thing to know is that may happen or may not. Maybe we'll get lucky and all these systems will work. Maybe we'll get unlucky and some of them won't, and we'll have an absolute cluster F starting on January the 1st. But if that does happen, that doesn't mean Brexit is a failure. And equally, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't mean Brexit is a success. The short-term impacts are basically, from an economic point of view, are really noise. They will make a lot of headlines, either if things go well or if they don't, but they really don't tell you very much about the medium to long-term economic impacts of Brexit. That will happen over a while. It'll be much harder to identify, and economists will spend a lot of time arguing about them. We do know that the first order of Brexit effects will be those additional trade barriers that will make us somewhat poorer and less productive over time, not right away, but over time. That's almost a given. The second order, the indirect effects of Brexit, what it does to the UK's industrial structure, what it does to government policy in other respects, and hence to UK economic performance, that's a much more complex question to which there will never be any definitive answers. So while I'm pretty confident of what the direct impacts of Brexit will be, the indirect ones, both economic, political, and social, will be with us for decades. And those I think nobody can predict definitively at this point what they're going to be. So on that note of uncertainty, I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Beauty of Zoom. I was on mute. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your analysis. And speaking actually about the economic implications that you kindly outlined here, what is your take, Rebecca? Like, what does it mean also for the EU? Like, what kind of implications can we expect? I mean, COVID-19 has massively hit our economies hard. In fact, Gordon Brown was saying today in the Financial Times that we should be having a G20 leaders summit as soon as Biden is elected to basically build the economy back together. So what can we expect? Can you please give us your views?
So first of all, thank you very much for including me. As you can hear from my accent, I was not born on the continent. I have been a European for about as long as Britain has been trying to leave. So quite the trade. Also, hello. Hello to my friends in the US and Canada who have logged in to watch. This is my first time zone friendly public event, and it's really a treat to see your names in the sidebar. So thank you for coming. In terms of where we're headed, the last thing I read is it's all coming down to fish. But fish are the current incarnation of the quintessential recurring problem, which is the Brits want fish to be separate, and the EU is consistent in saying nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. This is the way Europe operates. Europe likes to have a deal. So Britain can keep pushing to the last minute because all things considered, the EU preference is always to have something they can call a deal rather than to walk away without anything to show for it. But also nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. The whole point of the EU is that everything is agreed. So this idea still that we can separate out fish, or we can separate out derivatives trading, or we can separate out these particular high controversy ideas, it shows that the process is still being seen very differently. And I guess I'd like to respond to Gordon Brown and the FT. How nice that he would like a G20 summit. How convenient that the UK is an individual actor in the G20 as opposed to one of many in the EU. I mean, that's great. I'm in favor of international cooperation. But the point here is that the EU is a bloc, the UK is leaving it, and now that the UK has left it, the EU is no longer incorporating the British position into its public policy. This is something that still doesn't seem to sink in, whether it's through the deal negotiations or foreign policy or what have you. There's a million different ways to say it, but that's where we come back to. In terms of the EU's relationship with Turkey, my background is in finance and economics. It is not in neighborhood policy. However, I think we can generally expect a retrenching of the EU 27, an attempt to consolidate, an attempt to really build on the ever closer union that the pandemic has brought. This next generation EU recovery package is a really big step. It involves joint borrowing. It involves breaking a lot of things that have been red lines for a lot of core EU members for a long time, something that might not have been possible had the UK remained in the bloc for all of its opt-outs. They still might have wanted to get involved. So the EU is going to be focused on that. And it would be tempting to say that once Brexit is done, there'll be time to spend time on other foreign policy matters. Maybe think about the Middle East a little bit more, think about Africa. But the truth is Brexit isn't going to be done. If there's no deal, it'll be kind of a mess and it'll have to be cleaned up. And if there is a deal, the deal will be that things more or less stay the same until the point where the UK changes its rules. We expect the UK to change its rules. That's the whole point, is divergence. So that means we'll have constant renegotiations, and that's under a deal. So that's how things look from here. The EU 27 has made the most of this year, for the most part, to try and come together. The people who are not part of the Euro area have definitely seen a weakening of their positions, and you see that in terms of some of the negotiations. But generally, Europe is going to muddle through and get through this.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. You touched on many points, which I will come on to in the Q&A part. But the biggest question in the room is also, does sovereignty mean power, as it's portrayed in the UK? What does it mean to be sovereign in the new day and age? So I think you touched on this slightly as well. So I want to come to that in a moment. But thank you for your assessment from the European side. Going on to Tom. Tom, I would like to get your take about, I mean, what we're hearing now is, well, there is sort of a 60-40% likelihood from the UK government at number 10 that this deal will happen. So what's your take on that? What are you hearing? And especially, what does it mean? I mean, if we have a no deal or a deal, and what, yeah, share us your views, please.
Yeah. I've been saying for the last few weeks really that I think there's a sort of 52% chance of a deal, maybe 48% chance of no deal. And I think that so often there is this willingness on both sides to sort of construct a narrative in commentary that suits your own perspective. Either this is sort of a disaster, a capitalist government intent on achieving no deal for some nefarious ends because they want to crash the economy and somehow that will help them. Or you get the sort of Faragist view of things, which is that, oh, this deal was sewn up months ago and this is all theatre. And I think both of those analyses are completely wrong and couldn't be further from the truth. I was speaking to someone who's in the British negotiating team just earlier today about this meeting, that it's fortuitous timing actually that we're having this conversation at the same time that the Prime Minister is speaking to Ursula von der Leyen. That's a genuine conversation. That is because there is something that they're stuck in on the talks, they're stuck on in the talks, but they think that there is a political way through. So yes, there is movement, there's slow movement. I think it's marginally more likely that there'll be a deal than there won't be, but it's very much on the cards that there could be no deal, and that's nothing to be afraid of. I think that sometimes people underestimate the extent to which Brexit is a political project, not an economic project. And to a great degree in this negotiation, the British side has prized political objectives above economic ones. Now, in my view, those political objectives will bear fruit in the medium to long term, as I think it's pretty clear the direction that the EU is going in economically, and in terms of its integration would see the UK as being incredibly sidelined within that project, not being able to make any of the big decisions. You can't lead in a group if you refuse to accept that group's currency. You can't lead in a group if you're being sort of the anchor, stopping the very clear political direction that that group has been moving in, ever since Maastricht, really. So I think that there are benefits to come from that political project that then can bear fruit economically. But the economics isn't the first thing that this government is concerned about. It's an important part, but the most important part is that phrase that we've heard so much for so many years now: taking back control, being able to decide the own rules and regulations that govern your country. And ultimately, the UK is a more free market country generally. We are sort of on that axis of within the European Union that has been pushing for a lighter touch state of affairs when it comes to how competitive we can be. And so really being able to stop being held back so much by, I don't know, the more protectionist or agricultural economies, and moving towards a nimbler state of affairs can be positive. And we've seen this in just the last 2 weeks. Again, not an economic decision, but one to do with health. We're seeing a political project within the EU where 27 member states decided to move at the pace of the slowest member state in order so that every single EU state gets the vaccine at exactly the same time. And that means that Germany, the country that arguably did most to develop the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, is not getting their citizens vaccinated, while people in Britain are, because we've been able to move in a more nimble way as an independent country. Now, yes, of course, there are opt-outs within EU law, but the political project, I think, is what matters more. And so that's just a really clear example as to why this government sees it as so advantageous to have that political autonomy as the ultimate goal here.
Thank you, Tom. I think we will come back on the taking back control mantra in our discussions as well. And thank you for your assessment from the UK side on getting back or taking back control. Moving on, before I move on to our next speaker, I want to encourage all our attendees, obviously, to use the Q&A section here in this chat. Feel free to already ask questions, be proactive. Whatever you want to comment on, please feel free to put it into the chat. And next one, Thomas, you you are also you put another academic perspective into this from an economic angle from the LSE. So what does it mean? Like, can we ask you, what does Australia deal mean for those on the call? And what does a Canada deal mean? I mean, we keep throwing these terminologies around in the media, but the normal citizen doesn't really know what that really means. Can you enlighten us a little bit? And what's your take on how things are moving at the moment? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps the kind of most useful way to think about the options facing the UK at this point, we're down to a situation where it's either going to be a relatively thin free trade agreement or there's going to be a no deal outcome. So, as Jonathan mentioned, regardless of whether we get a deal or not, it's certain at this stage that we are leaving the single market and that we are leaving the customs union. And, from an economic perspective, though, that decision to leave the single market and the customs union is the most significant one. So, what then is the kind of remaining difference between having a deal, which you could refer to as a Canada type deal, though I think, the deal we're likely to get is in many ways not going to be the same as the one Canada has, or a no deal, which, the government likes to refer as an Australia type deal, though, that's something of a misnomer. Really, it would be reverting to trading with the EU under the terms of the kind of World Trade Organization. In practice, the only kind of substantial difference between deal and no deal is that there will be tariffs on UK-EU trade in the event of no deal. Whereas we are expecting that the deal that is being potentially negotiated will allow for tariff-free and completely quota-free access on cross-channel trade. So for most sectors, tariffs are very low or even zero. So, for most sectors, that distinction between deal or no deal is not that important. But then there are a few, and potentially quite, high-profile salient sectors where tariffs are kind of higher and more important. The one that is frequently talked about is the car sector. There will be a 10% tariff on UK imports of cars from the EU and exports going to the EU if there's a no deal. And it is always something of a fool's errand to try and make precise predictions about how particular sectors are going to respond to Brexit. But certainly, the car companies have been making noises suggesting that they don't think their business models in terms of producing in the UK are viable in the event of a no deal. Even if there is a deal, they are concerned that the additional checks at the border will kind of reduce the efficiency of their just-in-time supply chains. They rely on being able to bring parts in and out of the country to arrive at the factory just when they're needed. That is going to become more costly once there is a customs border in place, and particularly, in the long run, it's going to kind of become more costly but predictable. In the short term, the initial few months after the transition period expires, they face a bigger problem, which is going to be that that there are likely to be delays. But as Jonathan said, we have no real idea how long those delays are going to be, and you can't run a just-in-time supply chain if you don't know how long it's going to take goods to cross the border. So there's that concern regardless if we get a deal, and then on top of that, the 10% tariff if there is a deal. So it's a potential big problem for the car sector. The other industry where no deal would be very problematic from a tariff point of view is agriculture. Throughout the world, free trade agreements typically make progress in reducing tariffs in everywhere except for agriculture, and the EU is no exception. It is a very protectionist block when it comes to agriculture, which means if there's a no deal, you will be looking at tariffs, tariff equivalents, certainly, in some agricultural sectors up to 40–50%. That would be bad news for, say, UK, the dairy industry in the UK, a lot of meat producers, particularly sheep farmers. The Welsh sheep industry probably couldn't survive no deal. So there will be particular kind of sectors within agriculture that are not necessarily very important on aggregate, but which stand to suffer very kind of heavy concentrated losses in the event of no deal. And I think, one of the political concerns with no deal is that the the negative effect on those sectors would be very visible, would probably generate a lot of negative media coverage, and could lead to a kind of a backlash against Brexit of the type that you wouldn't necessarily see from kind of more broad-based costs. So, for example, to give one example, and then I'll finish. After the referendum, when sterling depreciated, that led to an increase in inflation in the UK, which probably increased the cost of living for the average household by around 2%. So that's a substantial cost for the economy as a whole. But because it occurred gradually over 2 years and no one kind of was dramatically hit by it, most households probably didn't notice it in the churn of everything else that was going on. So I think that the real risk of no deal is you have these concentrated losses in a few sectors which become very obvious and very salient.
Thank you, Thomas. Does that thank you for your take also on what it means for tariffs. But I would like to know, like what we are hearing over the news in the past few days. British citizens, or basically citizens living in the United Kingdom, are buying a lot of supplies just because they're afraid of a no-deal scenario. The toilet paper, the famous case, is becoming more prominent again. So, Tom, what's your take? Like, should we storage all of this? Like, I would like to just get your quick comments on those.
I would not expect shortages certainly of essential goods, right? Any good that is sufficiently important that it's deemed essential, there are ways of bringing goods into the country, even if the borders are choked up at Dover. If there are essential medicines that you need, you can charter planes to bring them in. It increased the costs, so there's a cost to it, but you can get them in there. I think what's less clear, and I don't really have a strong opinion on this, is whether we are likely to see, it would be temporary, but temporary shortages of some particularly fresh produce. The concern is that if there are extensive delays at the border, at this time of year, we get a lot of our fresh produce, tomatoes, lettuce from Europe. If trucks are sitting at the border for a week, that produce is going to be rotten before it reaches the UK, and probably, producers will just choose not to send it to the UK. So there is that risk if border delays are kind of particularly bad. I think, at this stage, it's really hard to predict how extensive any border disruption might be. But I don't think you can't stockpile fresh produce anyway by their nature, so I don't see much advantage to stockpiling at this point. As a consumer, if you're a firm and you require you need certain inputs to run your car factory, for example, then it makes a lot more sense to bring them in before the borders get snarled up. It seems like it might be too late for that already.
All right, yeah, thank you, Thomas, and I will take the questions that are coming from the floor. Thank you to all participants. But yeah, just want to make the round quickly on what the other panelists' take is on the tariffs and the implications after the 1st of January. So Tom, Howard, what do you think? Did you start to storage things, or do you agree with Thomas that that shouldn't be an issue?
No, I don't think a single. I think that the number of people who are stockpiling stuff is obviously very, very tiny. We're not seeing a material impact in any shop. I live in quite a Remain voting area, and I haven't seen a single impact in any of the shops near where I live. I don't think that anyone is seriously doing this sort of stuff, and I don't think you have this sort of hysteria that we have lived through in recent months during the pandemic. We know what it looks like when there's a run on a certain good, when people do start to stockpile and the shelves do deplete, and they haven't. I don't think many people are doing this, but I think we are missing one other half to the story when we're talking about tariffs. Yes, of course, no deal means that in order to export our goods, the EU will impose tariffs on us, but we'll have complete control over our tariffs with the rest of the world. So that means in terms of imports, if we so chose, we could make them a lot cheaper, and we could unilaterally slash tariffs. Of course, the WTO means that you'd have to do that with all of the countries around the world, but I don't see that as any bad thing. If effectively, I don't see why we would want to tax our consumers more for importing goods from overseas. It seems like a useful step to do some unilateral free trade moves that have been successful in places like Hong Kong and New Zealand. And that in some ways would be an opportunity. Yes, tough on exporters, and perhaps we shouldn't be so reliant or so subsidising of an agricultural sector in this country anyway. But it's in terms of imports, the tariff issue is completely under our control under no deal.
Thank you for your intake, Tom. Rebecca, do you want to respond to that right away?
Let me bring up Northern Ireland, which has yet to come up in this conversation. Northern Ireland is the one part of the UK that has a land border with the EU and is a place where, and I haven't been in a while, but I read that grocery stores in particular are very worried about the effect of tariffs, about the effect of supplies, trying to work out if there's going to be a border of any kind between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain is something that gives people pause, and something that should give people pause. This is an area that has been through a lot. And here we are, we've been talking for half an hour and no one has even mentioned them yet, and they have some of the most to lose. So for a country that thinks of itself as the United Kingdom, Great Britain, that sees its place in the world as historic and comprehensive, you really see the discussion focusing on London and places you can drive to in a couple of hours from London. That's a political choice that the UK as a sovereign can make, but I don't know that it's the most constructive way to get through this.
Yeah, that's indeed a good point. And it's interesting that Northern Ireland was the biggest elephant in the room a few months ago. And now everything seems to be stumbled on the fishery question. So what, I mean, I would like to know what, Jonathan, you think, like, is it really fisheries that's the elephant in the room right now, or are we still on the level playing field issues? Because it seems a bit like it's a bit of greenwashing at the moment, what's going on.
As I said, I mean, I don't know what's going on in the negotiating room. I don't think, frankly, anybody outside really does. There is a general consensus view that assuming that the level playing field issues are resolved on the terms that you know, the UK has accepted the point of, you know, the EU has accepted the point of principle that the UK is sovereign, which they did all along after Brexit. The UK has accepted the point of principle that the EU will have the right in some circumstances to impose tariffs if the UK diverges in certain ways. And the discussion now is on the detail of the mechanism that allows the EU to do that within the agreement. Then fish will presumably be sorted one way or the other. It may still be that both sides chooses both sides to blame any breakdown on fish for political reasons, but it's very difficult to see why you would allow an industry that is worth less to the UK economy than one department store, Harrods, to crash these talks, frankly. You know, so you know, that doesn't seem very credible. Let me pick up on Tom's point, because it's an interesting one, about the you know, what could the UK do to mitigate this? And Tom's right. You know, we could, should we choose to drop all tariffs on everything in the event of a no deal. We could move to unilateral free trade. But I think it's an illustration to, you know, and in, you know, it illustrates in some way the sort of slight lack of political reality of some of the claims that I think some Brexiteers make, that, you know, the UK will be this wonderful free market paradise outside the EU. And indeed, some of the exaggerated and slightly fantastical fears and paranoid fantasies that some people on the EU side have when they talk about Singapore on Thames or whatever. The truth is, it ain't going to happen, because it's not, the political economy of the UK doesn't work like that. We are, contrary to what you and what Ennis said at the beginning, we are Europeans too, and we're European in our attitudes towards the economy, towards social welfare and the rest of it. We are not going to move to unilateral free trade. The UK has already announced what its tariff structure is going to be, deal or no deal, and it looks 90-something% like the tariff structure that the EU already has. Basically, we've dropped tariffs on a few goods that we don't need to protect, and we've rounded some tariff down and made the whole structure simpler and more rational, all of which is a very good thing, entirely sensible. But we are not doing what Patrick Minford suggested we, and some of the loony, the very few loonies who on the Brexit side suggested, which is to drop all barriers, forget about tariffs, forget about safety standards and regulatory standards, allow in everything, and allow UK manufacturing to vanish. That's not going to happen. And as I've said, in some respects, of course, we may well, it is quite unclear whether the divergence that we're seeking is actually, as in the case of state aid, not about adopting a free market approach, but adopting a less free market approach. The reason the UK wants freedom to do what it wants to do on state aid without EU interference is not because we want to have a more free market type policy. It's not because we want to be like Hong Kong. It's because some people in this government want us to be more like France. Well, fine. I mean, there are arguments for or against that. But it's not the idea that there's some sort of radical liberal small L economic transformation in prospect seems to me to fly in the face of the facts.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I just want to take, related to your comment, a question from the floor. It's asking what would be the greatest threats to consumers other than, the price of goods. So what do you think are the greatest threats to consumers?
Well, I mean, as I said, I mean, in the short term, there may be some disruption. I mean, I agree with both Toms, we're not going to run out of either toilet paper or essential drugs. And if the price of cheese, chocolate, and wine goes up, that certainly is not something I personally will welcome, since they're the main components of my personal diet. But it's not something that that threatens the social structure of this country, or that we should be particularly concerned about in the short term, frankly. There will be other problems. There are other inconveniences that will affect consumers. Travel to Europe, in particular, people who go on business trips, service providers who offer services. There will be, we in the university sector will have to deal with a bunch of issues relating to EU students, the likely cancellation of the Erasmus program, and so on. All these are things that matter quite a bit to actual real people. They make us poorer or less well off, both in the short or long run. But I don't think we should regard them as catastrophes or the end of the world either, necessarily. They're inconveniences. And I think, that is the British economy, and the British economy and society will adjust to Brexit. It's not going to make us, either now or over 10 years, into a poor country. It's just likely to mean that we will be somewhat we will get better off somewhat more slowly, and we will face somewhat more restrictions and regulations and bureaucratic red tape than we otherwise would have.
Yeah, you're right. So let's move on from the toilet paper discussion. Seems like all participants agree that, citizens in the UK will not starve to death. So that's good to know. Moving on to the next point, actually related to that. So obviously, with the Northern Ireland topic that you opened up, Rebecca, there was the issue of the Scottish independence, which is still, hanging in the air. So whether we have a no deal, in the end, we will have a deal. What does it mean for Scottish independence and for the UK integrity in the long term? How do you foresee developments in that space? Maybe, Rebecca, I start with you and then.
So speaking personally, I think that Brexit will increase discussion in Scotland about what happens next, but I do not personally think that Scotland will try to leave, or at least try seriously to leave. It is my view that the Scots are too attached to the pound. And joining the EU will require joining a commitment to join the euro. And I think that's a deal breaker. For all of the other reasons why Scotland might like to be affiliated with the EU, I think the pound is going to keep Scotland firmly part of the UK. While I'm here, I'd like to take the Joe Biden question, because this is a country near and dear to my heart. And my answer to that, I don't know if attendees, if you can see the Q&A, we had a question, how will the UK relationship with the incoming Biden administration look like? President-elect Biden is going to be very focused on getting the domestic situation in the US under control. There have been 4 years of chaos. The outgoing administration is actively trying to dismantle government on its way out the door. There's a lot to keep track of. Also, Congress is in flux. There may very well be total gridlock. So a lot of attention is going to be there. The US has a lot of work to do rebuilding its foreign policy, and that is going to be focused primarily on the Middle East, figuring out how to work with or around China, and figuring out what to do in terms of climate change, rejoining the Paris Accords, but then what does that really mean from a policy perspective? There are a lot of questions there. So the UK can expect the US to be cordial, friendly, but I don't see a lot of attention. You know, and the UK and the world generally is going to get that kind of response. It's not that people have anything against the UK, but it's a small country that people more or less agree with. And I just don't see it rising to the top of the policy agenda after Brexit in the way that the British public discussion would have you believe is inevitable. There's a real mismatch there in what's being talked about in London and what's being talked about in the rest of the world.
Thank you for your take, Rebecca. Tom, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just find it hard to accept really that the UK is a small country. I mean, by what metric? We're the 5th largest economy in the world, according to the World Bank this year. We have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. We have some of the only aircraft carriers in the world. I don't know what countries are bigger than us really in terms of global political reach, other than obviously the US and China. Obviously, the EU doesn't have a foreign policy angle, and I don't think it will. Germany's completely wiped out in that field, so is Japan. I mean, the large players in this field have and always will include the UK, and especially as we're hosting COP26 next year, this is the angle by which we'll be most aligning ourselves with the Biden regime. That's the way that this administration in the UK is sort of tapping into the US administration, particularly through that angle of climate, through being sort of a really ambitious climate leader, and of course the UK's policy goal to join the TPP, or the CPTPP, I should say. These are all things that the government is clearly looking in terms of its global reach, and I think that particularly its focus on climate change and all of the statements that, I mean, the first congratulatory statement that the Prime Minister put out for President-elect Biden, the first policy that it mentioned was climate change. It's very, very clear that this is going to be the bridge that this government is going to try and construct, and using that forum of COP26 to build that relationship, and then through climate change, through policy to trade.
I actually think that's a good point, and it applies domestically as well. I think you can make a pretty powerful argument that while Brexit is clearly going to be a net negative for the UK economy, that the government's decision, Boris Johnson's decision, which he clearly again, as usual, about for a while, to very firmly pin himself to a very aggressive net zero, an aggressive approach to net zero strategy, to the net zero target, to actually taking it seriously and really nailing the government's colours to the mast, that will have more of an impact on the UK's economy, society and industrial structure over the next 20 to 30 years than almost anything else, and almost certainly than Brexit, for good or ill. In other words, that how, having made that commitment and having made it into something that appears now to be accepted across the political spectrum, how we rise to that challenge is going to shape our economy probably in more fundamental ways than the additional trade barriers and regulatory barriers that will be a result from Brexit. Again, I think that point to a particularly liberal or free market future for the UK, because that implies, even if achieved by some mixture of market and state-led mechanisms, which I think we all agree it probably will have to be, that really puts an awful lot of responsibility on the quality of government policy making in this space for the next few years. And I think, it is a good point, actually, that really is a very important and fundamental choice which this government has made, and which, as I say, may well shape our future as much, if not more, than Brexit.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I think you touched on a very important point there, like moving from the whole Scotland issue to multilateralism, which is the key word that you all touched on. So we're talking about a global Britain. As you said, Tom, the United Kingdom is leading the G7 next year, is leading the COP26 next year, and there will be serious discussions with economic recovery happening in the G20. So with all that in mind, and the US rejoining the WHO and the climate accords, like, I want to pose the question a bit towards Thomas as well. Thomas, what do you think? I mean, how does multilateralism evolve in 2021? Will multilateralism be stronger? What's the role of the UK in this whole progress?
So, I mean, the end of the Trump administration by itself will obviously be a boost for multilateralism, because at the very least, the Biden administration will have a kind of a basic commitment to international institutions and to kind of traditional Western alliances that the Trump administration lacked. So, in that sense, and you can think about the WTO as one example, there's going to be kind of scope to make progress through international institutions in a way that hasn't been achieved for the last 4 years. That said, whether there will be actual, concrete progress, either in terms of kind of setting more ambitious global climate goals, or on the trade front in terms of kind of fixing the dispute settlement process at the WTO, or launching a major round of trade negotiations. The constraints which have prevented that happening, though the Trump administration has kind of articulated these in a rather sort of unusually combative manner, the fundamental problem is kind of domestic political constraints that particularly prevent the US from making these commitments. And I think the Biden administration is going to run into a lot of the same problems on that front. You can think of the US-China trade war as another example. I think a lot of the rhetoric will be dialed down, but the tensions between the US and China, which come from kind of China's status as a rising power, which is challenging the US, and also from kind of more serious economic disputes about what intellectual property policy should be, those tensions aren't going to go away. So I guess I'm a little skeptical that there is likely to be much progress in the immediate future.
All right, thank you, Thomas. So, talking about obviously the main focus obviously of the Circle Foundation is Turkey. So I think Enes would chop my head off if I don't touch the topic on Turkey. So the thing is, Turkey is one of the trade deal agreements, that's evolving. So what's your take on the Turkish-UK relations going forward, and what type of deal can we expect? I just leave the question open to the floor. Who wants to take it? Maybe Rebecca or Thomas.
I was just going to say, the reason, that there hasn't been progress on a Turkey-UK rollover deal so far is obviously that Turkey is in a customs union with the EU, which really means until we know what UK-EU relations are going to be, there isn't scope for pinning down our relations with Turkey. What I hope will happen in early 2021, once either we know we're in a deal or no deal situation, is the UK moves towards a free trade agreement with Turkey. We're no longer going to be in a customs union with Turkey, but there should be scope for assume we get an ambitious free trade deal with or zero tariff free trade deal with the EU, to hopefully getting something similar with Turkey, and that that should be the priority for the first 6 months of 2021, if possible.
I mean, perhaps I can just remind people of this. The infamous Vote Leave poster, which said Turkey population 66 million is joining the EU, and then it followed up with a poster saying Turkey is next door to Iraq and Syria. Britain's new border, if it's a member of the EU, is with Syria and Iraq. I mean, I think we did see, and that wasn't even the Farage campaign. That was the Vote Leave campaign. So we did see during the referendum campaign a very deliberate attempt by Vote Leave to use fairly directly racist and xenophobic language directed specifically at Turkey, and at the idea that if the UK remained in the EU, there would be a flood of Turkish immigration, and that we would be open to a flood of Turkish immigration. That was very explicit in that poster. Now, I don't think actually, of course, that was a political ploy. Boris Johnson doesn't particularly believe that sort of thing. He does it when it's useful. But we should remember that there is, that at least some of the Vote Leave campaign was predicated on that. So the chances of a really close relationship with Turkey in terms of allowing some of the flows, at least of people, that were possible to a limited extent in the EU through the association agreement, may be a while away. Although hopefully, as Thomas said, there will be the trade relationship can at least be reestablished.
Thank you, Jonathan. I will head it over right away to Tom, because Tom, you had the experience with Vote Leave and Turkey. Obviously, the buzzword is something you have been working with for the past years until Brexit happened. So what's the response to Jonathan?
Well, one of the big reasons why dissatisfaction with the EU grew markedly from, the Treaty of Nice right up until you had your sort of peak opinion polls in 2011, 2012, 2013, where Leave was double digits ahead of Remain in every question that was asked, however it was phrased, was because of that expansion. And people saw the EU as a project that was getting a bit out of control, a bit too big. They thought of it as a much more manageable relationship when it was fewer countries. And I think it's a legitimate point to make in a referendum that this is an organisation that is changing, that is expanding, that has a history of doing that, and that Turkey is in the process of joining the EU. That's just stating a fact. And of course, there was that famous clip of David Cameron saying that he wanted to pave the road from Ankara to Brussels. That's something that I don't think there was great political consent for within the UK. And actually, when we look at the UK's foreign policy aims for 2021, the first trip that Boris is going to be making is to go across to India, which is a country that we will be bringing in to a sort of almost anti-China alliance of what has started to be referred to in some sectors as the D10, that group of democracies in the world against the rising tide of autocracy. And I'm not sure how much Turkey in its current political trajectory fits into that worldview of combining, particularly strengthening, the Five Eyes relationship, particularly strengthening relationships potentially with India. These, I think, are going to be the big steps, the big aims of the UK geopolitically. And I think while Turkey is under the perhaps less than democratic slide that it is right now, that's quite hard to square.
Thank you, Tom. Rebecca, do you want to bring in the EU angle? What's your comments on Tom's input?
Well, funnily enough, Brexit, I think, is a catalyst to rethink the whole enlargement process, which people have been wanting to do anyway. Enlargement, even for countries like Montenegro that have worked very hard to do everything that was expected of them, is very much on hold while the EU considers these existential questions of how it makes decisions, how it wants to proceed as a coherent whole. Certainly from where we sit today, to the extent that Turkey is on an accession path, it is almost more of a trade negotiation than it is a real talk at this point about joining the EU. There are way too many steps in the future. It's a way to keep the door open. It's a way to have some dialogue. It's not something that's likely to happen in the immediate future. From a security perspective, my fellow panelists are right to note that the UK certainly plays a larger role security-wise than it does in some of these single market issues. The thing is, a lot of the multilateral security arrangements are kind of stuck. NATO is stuck. The US is going to hopefully revisit the Iran deal. There are a lot of ways where things are just not moving a whole lot. I mean, it would be great if the UK can jumpstart, constructive measures in some of these areas. But since its participation in these bodies, the UN, in NATO, isn't going to change as a result of Brexit, as a result of leaving the EU single market, I'm not sure where that leaves us. I think that's just a bit of status quo on sort of another track.
Thank you, Rebecca. Just want to stay on this whole global focus, and you touched on security. And I think one of the major issues is the UK is leaving Europol, and they have announced, the National Crime Agency has already announced that a lot of changes will be happening. So my question to the panelists is, how do you think the future of UK security will be affected? Will the UK be more isolated? And apart from that, what does it mean with the UK's impact on the European defense? Will we have a European army? And will it be against the UK army? So what is your take on these whole issues? So Thomas, can I give the floor to you, and then please take it on.
I mean, preface anything I would say on this topic with that, I'm not far from an expert on security topics or on how cross-border security cooperation works. Clearly, there are advantages being plugged into kind of the EU cooperation mechanisms in terms of policing and security, which we will lose. Hopefully, over time, we will be able to negotiate at least some kind of partial replacement for those. Though I mean, whether that does end up being the case, we'll have to see. On the broader question of whether this leaves the UK kind of more isolated, I mean, I think it's hard to give a definitive answer to that question. It really depends on the topic we're talking about. I mean, the UK will certainly be more isolated when it comes to European affairs, because we're not going to have a seat at the table where most Europe-wide decisions are going to be made. But as kind of Rebecca alluded to, for decisions that are made through the Security Council or other multilateral fora where we sit independently, it's not necessarily going to affect our role there. So I think it really depends on what issue we're talking about.
Thank you, Thomas. Who wants to take the security question next? I'm
happy to jump in here, because during the referendum campaign, actually, there were elements of security that were campaign issues for Vote Leave. I remember the European arrest warrant coming up as a negative of EU membership, because there were all these horror stories of, British holidaymakers who got accused of this, that, or the other, then were extradited to countries with perhaps inferior legal systems, held without trial for months, even years in some cases, and had enormous miscarriages of justice. So to some extent, either not being within that system or having it reformed could be a positive when we're thinking about the liberty of individuals living in this country, because there have been some truly, I remember there was one story in particular that received a lot of press about a British student who had gone on holiday to Greece, came back home and was extradited under the European arrest warrant and spent years in prison before he had a trial which quickly dismissed the case. I mean, this was the sort of thing that was going on. So sometimes I think there's the other side of the coin here. There's the liberty versus the security aspect. But I think there's the other thing that we're talking about. Yes, of course, the UK is within the Five Eyes, sits within NATO, is a big voice in that already. But I think there's a political impetus that comes about from Brexit, a new way that the UK sees itself in the world. And whilst, yes, a lot of stuff might have been possible before, I'm not sure that there would have been the impetus, the political momentum to push this stuff. So I think that is going to come about as well. And especially now where we're seeing a much closer relationship with countries like Australia just on the horizon. I imagine from everything I'm hearing, we're going to have a trade deal with Australia signed in the months following leaving the single market at the end of this year. Sort of in the first half of next year is the most likely time that we'll get a trade deal with Australia, and with that sort of banding together of Five Eyes countries against the Chinese threat that's rising, particularly in the wake of Hong Kong and quite frankly of the coronavirus cover-ups and all that sort of thing. I think that sort of meshes with the Brexit worldview of wanting to sort of take a step beyond the continent that we exist on and make a more proactive use of the roles that we sit in the rest of the world.
Rebecca, do you want to jump in on that?
My take is that it'll take a while to see how these things evolve, because in the short run, everybody knows each other. And if someone wants to work with the UK or the UK wants to work with someone else, they know who their counterpart is. They can pick up the phone, they can make the call, they can make it work. But when the UK loses its seat at the table, it loses any ability to influence these policies. And it also loses the institution side, which means the next generation, as people retire, as people change jobs, the relationships won't be there going forward. So this will be something that will really happen in years to come. And the other thing I want to say on this is what Tom laid out really, I think, leaves out the perspective of Brits living abroad. There are an awful lot of Brits living in continental Europe who like it there, who have their families there, who see themselves very much as Britons, but also Britons who live off the island. And for those people, where do they stand? And the answer seems to be no one's really looking out for them.
It is worth noting that more Brits live in just one country, Australia, than in all EU 27 countries. So in terms of the British diaspora, it's actually much more focused in the sort of the English-speaking parts of the world than the continent that's just on our doorstep.
Is this where I mentioned that Australia was a prison colony? Is that your model?
That's not a model at all. I'm just simply saying that there are perhaps countries that, I mean, just quantifiably, there are countries that people vote with their feet that they want to immigrate to, perhaps more than some of the countries on our doorstep.
So, Rebecca and Tom, thank you. Jonathan, final remark from your side. I mean, we touched on the topic of, social political integrity, and obviously, in fact, I'm a German citizen living in the UK. We have a lot of British citizens living abroad in Europe. So will our future generations will be affected from this? Will we alienate from this global integrity that we always felt?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, the free movement will end on January the 1st. That is unfortunate from an economic and social perspective, in my view, in the sense that it was not just beneficial economically to the UK and to the continent, but some broader benefits. However, that doesn't mean that we won't see significant flows of people, ideas, families, etc., between the UK and the continent, as between the UK and the rest of the world. That was true before we had free movement in its current form, and it will be true afterwards, just under a different regime. And I do think that, one positive aspect of the last few years is that Theresa May's very restrictionist and nativist approach to immigration policy has been replaced by under Johnson, by a policy which is considered, it's not, it still has, still lots of things I would personally change, but is considerably more liberal than we would have had under Theresa May, and should still allow the UK to remain a relatively open country in immigration terms, both to Europeans and to the rest of the world. And at the same time, of course, the withdrawal agreement does provide for people who have already moved between the EU and the UK to have, if not exactly their existing rights as vote leave promised them, but to have broadly their existing rights are maintained and people can carry on. So, and at the same time, over the last few years, a significantly positive shift among the British public in terms of public attitudes towards immigration, both in terms of the social and the economic impacts of immigration. So while there is plenty of scope for improvement, I think the UK is not going to close its borders either to Europeans or to the world as a consequence of Brexit. It will be a new chapter, and we are losing some things which are official, but there are plenty of grounds for relative optimism as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. So coming towards the end of the session, I have 2 remaining questions left. So I will come in a minute. As we were talking, BBC announced to me that Boris and Ursula von der Leyen's discussions didn't go that well. So I think the no deal scenario is, again, a bit more weighing up, but of course, God knows. But before that, the last question that was asked in this chat is the spillover effect. As you know, when Brexit happened, Viktor Orban, one of the populist leaders here in the European Union, went off and was threatening an exit, and we were talking about different exit scenarios of other countries. So do you really think this case will spark a spillover effect? And will this threaten our European unity? Rebecca or Thomas, who wants to go first?
I don't see a huge realignment. Certainly when a country leaves, it does set a precedent for something that was supposed to not happen. On the other hand, Britain has always held itself apart. Britain has been weighing this, do we stay or do we go thing for so long that it has put itself in a different category. We've seen with the Euro crisis that certainly the Euro countries have really made it through some tough times and made it through together. And the non-Euro countries have a lot to gain from staying part of the world's largest economic market, the world's largest consumer market. So it's a lot of noise, but I think the EU27 will hang out for a while.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yeah, I would agree with Rebecca. I don't see any other countries leaving the EU in the foreseeable future. I mean, I think since the Leave vote, we've seen a kind of uptick in support for the EU in opinion polling in most countries, suggesting that there's kind of no immediate demand to follow the British example. And also the last 4 years have demonstrated how difficult it is to leave the EU, and kind of how what the costs of that are, and how it is not a simple decision. It requires all this kind of complicated unpicking of legal entanglements, and I don't see much appetite for that in any other countries, particularly for countries that are members of the euro. It's even kind of another layer of complexity. So I don't see it happening.
Tom?
I mean, yeah, the first goal of the European Union when Brexit was first voted for on the 23rd of June 16, was they were genuinely worried about a domino effect. And I think it was actually quite soon after that they realised they didn't have to be worried about that. Not least because the UK has had such a different relationship, as we've been discussing, with Europe than other European countries have had over the last decades. But also because we made it incredibly easy for them to make this process protracted and messy. We picked an incredibly weak prime minister and had an incredibly inconclusive election result that was supposed to drive home certainty. And so we had just scleroticism for 3 years that's dragged this process into being something that I don't think many countries would want to countenance. Now, I think it could have been done a whole lot better if we had a different domestic political setup over those 3 years. But I think to think of British Euroscepticism as being of a similar vein to continental populism, I think is a massive, massive error. There is nothing that unites the British Eurosceptic movement with the sort of Front National or Orban's party or the Sweden Democrats, or all of these. Actually, even Liga in Italy. I don't think they share a philosophical, a historical, or a temperamental affinity to the British Eurosceptic movement. And really, if a country in the EU27 were to leave, it would be from a very, very different place and of a different movement, of a different wave than Brexit was.
Okay, Jonathan, do you have final comments on that?
Broadly, I agree with what everyone else has said. That Brexit has made it less attractive for other countries to leave the EU. But as Tom just said, these countries have their own issues and problems. The EU has its own issues and problems, and the EU faces some very, very serious challenges. Poland and Hungary are governed by, especially Hungary, are being governed by regimes which frankly no longer merit the title of liberal democracy. That is a very, very serious existential threat from within to the EU. I don't think those countries will want to leave, because the governments of those countries are making, as we know, Orban and his associates are scooping billions of euros out of EU funds. Why would they want to leave? Nor do their public want, for good reason, for much better reason than that, nor do the publics of Poland and Hungary, who know very well that their place is in Europe, do they want to leave. But that really has almost nothing to do with Brexit. I mean, there are some Eurosceptics, frankly, who do here, Tom's not quite right, who do find the authoritarianism of Poland and Hungary and their leaders attractive. Dan Hannan, for example, is happy to pal up with these people. You can see it on Twitter, Tom, as when he congratulated the homophobic Polish president on his re-election. So there are some, but not despite that. Tommy is fundamentally right. The issues and anti-Euroscepticism in this country is fundamentally different from national authoritarian populism in the rest of Europe, and we should be grateful for that.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. So what we've learned in this session, we will surely, all the UK citizens will be in good hands. Nothing will majorly break down on the 1st of January. We know that alienation populism has been triggered by Brexit. That's what the discussions highlighted. But there is still a hope for a global Britain with their other memberships and a rise in multilateralism, hopefully. And the lessons learned from COVID, I think, have enforced some unity in the years to come. Surely the UK has as much to offer to the EU as vice versa. And I think we all agree on that. We are still interdependent. We're still neighbors. And I'm speaking about we because I see myself as a mediator of both angles. So I'm hopeful that, a deal will be sealed. But coming to my final questions, and I don't want to take up much of everyone's time. So here we are. A few minutes ago, 8 minutes ago, Ursula von der Leyen and Boris Johnson again said, okay, we have issues in our negotiations. So the EU is saying Sunday is the hard deadline, and the MPs want to ideally vote maybe on the Monday. Well, this scenario, will it happen, is the big question. Or in the 11th hour on the 31st of December, will something happen? Or will we have a short no-deal scenario in the new year, which will lead us to a long-term agreement? So My question to all the panelists, and by that question, I want to finish it off. If I want you to imagine hypothetically, if you were Boris Johnson or Ursula von der Leyen, pick one of those, what would you have done to not come to this point? You know, what if you would be in them, what would you have done differently or better? Rebecca?
All right, before I answer that, I do want to quickly come back to this question of Britons in the world. Historical jokes about Australia aside, it's a fine country with a lot of ties to the rest of the English-speaking world. And it's also a place where a lot of Brits move and their kids and their grandkids keep dual citizenship. That to me is a very different relationship than the British pensioner who works his or her entire life to save up for a place in Spain or France and then moves there with the expectation of maintaining ties and staying close and doesn't necessarily intend to become French or Spanish in the way that Australia expects people who migrate there to become Australian. To say that those people need to either go back to Britain or just kind of deal with the systems of where they are is a real change from the way that Brits have historically moved around the world and kept their ties to their homeland. And that would be a big change. If I were Boris Johnson, I guess I would have tried to make up my mind sooner, as Jonathan has pointed out multiple times.
All right. Thomas, do you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rebecca used my answer. At the end of the day, whether there's a deal or not will depend on what our Prime Minister decides, and it would have been useful if he'd made that decision 9 months ago, because the terms under which a deal was available have been clear for the past year. So let's get on and make a decision.
Tom?
If I were Ursula von der Leyen, I would have internalized the fact that the United Kingdom under this government is a very different negotiating partner than that existed not so much under the last Prime Minister, but under the last Parliament. This is a government that is happy to drive through no deal. This is a Parliament that has a 80-seat Conservative majority, every single one of whom signed up in their election pledges at the end of last year to get Brexit done. Beyond anything else, that is their biggest allegiance, and there is no domestic political obstacle to delivering no deal. And I think that the EU hasn't quite internalized that if they ask for too much, they will get nothing, and that doesn't seem like it's a satisfactory relationship.
Jonathan?
I slightly disagree with that, in that if there were no domestic political security, then Boris Johnson wouldn't have told Nissan workers at Sunderland that he had a deal which would guarantee no tariffs and trade. But
it did. He said for the next year it will guarantee no tariffs and trade.
He didn't say for the next year.
That's clearly what the context was. They were talking about the withdrawal agreement.
He said
he said we had a withdrawal deal.
He didn't say we had a withdrawal deal. He didn't say we had a withdrawal deal. He said he had a deal which would let us get back control of our laws and money and would ensure frictionless trade and tariffs. So we can all see the contradiction there. We all know what there's no point in trying to play clever games. We all know what he was trying to say, and we all know why it was. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a legitimate right as elected Prime Minister to then push through a new deal. He clearly has. I mean, I would step back and actually say, look, most of the mistakes, and here I do agree with Tom, most of the mistakes here actually predated Boris Johnson. The main mistake was made by by Theresa May and the Conservative government in the David Cameron, Theresa May, Michael Gove, and so on. In the first 6 months or 9 months of after the referendum, when they did not seek to generate a consensus for whatever outcome was being sought. And I'm not particularly pegging to a particular outcome, but they did not get consent. They did not create a consensus. They did not create an acceptance across the political spectrum. And I don't mean by that a compromise or some sort of we voted to Brexit, and they were quite right to take that as a mandate. But they didn't seek to create what some political scientists called losers' consent. A good example here is of what happened after the Welsh devolution referendum in 1997, which was passed by the tiniest of margins, even smaller than Brexit. But the winners there didn't say, oh, therefore we have, they said neither, oh, therefore we have to compromise and have half devolution and half not. They still set up the Welsh Assembly, but equally they didn't shut out everybody else and exclude them from the process of how that actually happened. And I think that there was a set of mistakes made by those people in power and control, not, and in a sense that seems to be to have done rather more damage than anything that has happened since.
Thank you, Jonathan, and Tom, and Rebecca, and Thomas for all your valuable contributions. I think in the end of the day, what this session has shown us, how much sovereignty or power we get, or how much taking back control it is. In the end of the day, in this globalized world, we are interdependent of each other, and this will come with its cost and benefits. But let's close on that note that whatever happens on the 31st of December, we will remain positive, especially the young generation, and we will not lose our hopes and strengthen the economies. And I think COVID-19 has shown to all of us that we can't deal with these problems alone. Problems are transnational, be it health or security or other matters. And I think with that spirit, I would like to close today's session, and I would like to thank you for all your valuable comments today. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.